It's my great pleasure to first introduce you Anna Janka. Anna is the first MA student to go through our recently established MA program at the University of Bern. So she is a true digital humanist because she got 30 ECTS from our school. No, at the same time, so I'm really happy to have her here, and she will talk about the digital part of her MA thesis. But I'm a bit sad at the same time because it's going to be the last time she's representing the University of Bern before she's switching to the University of Zurich, because they need also some DH input, and usually they buy it, as you can see, where she will pursue a PhD. So this is basically on the in her phase of switching from the MA to the PhD phase. Looking forward to hear from a gender perspective. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Today, like Tobias said, I'm going to present parts of my master's thesis in which I looked at group references in the Swiss governmental protocols. And the question is, why did I look at these old, maybe even a bit dusty historical documents and not focus on any newer text? Why is it important to look at these naming practices of the past? I chose to look at these historical protocols because in the debate about gender inclusive writing today, there are language preserving ideologies. And these ideologies state that there is one original form, which is perceived to be the generic masculine. Just to give a quick info, the generic masculine can, on one hand, supposedly only refer to male people, and on the other hand, at the same time, is seen as a gender overflowing category and can also supposedly include female and non-binary people as well. So only the original form, the generic masculine form, should be used. And more gender neutral or gender inclusive language forms are seen as new phenomena and should therefore be dismissed according to these language preserving ideology and people who subscribe to them. But are these gender inclusive forms really new? In my research, I focus on the Swiss Federal Council protocols, which were authoritative texts written by the dominant societal group at the time. And I wanted to see how they referred to groups in these protocols between 1848 and 1963. So after now talking about my why, I now want to tell you a bit more about how I prepared these Swiss governmental protocols that I worked with. These protocols are a documentation of all decisions made by the Federal Council as a whole. There were no debates or disagreements protocoled in these texts. And we also know whose worldview manifests itself in these documents, since they were written by the Vice Chancellor, meaning a well-educated, wealthy Swiss man. And there are also some stylistic guidelines in these protocols that state that the text should be a short, precise, and neutral summary of the meeting, and that anything superfluous should be avoided. The documents between 1848 and 1903 are handwritten texts, which were made machine readable and formatted into TXT files with the help of the tool Transkribus. And the Digital Humanities team of the University of Bern digitized these protocols. And since I am working for them, I was able to get access to these documents before they were now in the spring released to the public. The protocols between 1904 and 1963 were written with a typewriter, and they are openly available on the website of the Federal Archive. Through web scraping, I downloaded the PDF files with the reference numbers that you can see on the screen. And then I extracted the text from the PDF files, and I created one text file per year for both the handwritten text that I talked about previously and the typewriter text. So just to tell you a bit more about these reference numbers, the first number indicates the first protocol of 1904, while the last number is the last protocol from December 17th until December 31st of 1963. Since there are so many documents, in total I worked with over 13,000 protocols, I was unable to look at each one of them that I downloaded, and therefore cannot guarantee that I was able to grab all of the documents, which is also one of the limitations of my work. Another limitation would be that the HTR and OCR text recognition ran into some problems with the format of the documents. So on the left, you can see that there are spaces between the characters of important words. This caused some problems with the later on analysis. And on the right, you can see that some notes were written down on the side of the protocols, and these notes were in the layout analysis, then sometimes merged together with the main text on the left side. So for my analysis, I used 3 different methods: the part of speech tagging, regex, and manual annotations. And the idea was, since these 3 methods all have their advantages and limitations, to use them conjointly to ensure a comprehensive analysis of the forms that were used by the Federal Council. So for the part of speech tagging, I used a spacey model that was based on newer newspaper texts, and I then extracted all plural nouns and put them into separate groups according to their gender. So I differentiated between masculine, feminine, neutral, and no gender assigned. And then I had to manually move them into the female, into the male, and into a neutral group for my analysis. So why was this necessary? It was necessary since the automatically assigned gender of a word does not always correspond with the actual grammatical gender of a word. So in the first 2 examples, in die Kunstgewerblerinnen und die Eigentümerinnen, die Eigentümer, the assigned gender corresponds with the grammatical gender, but the automatic assignment does not always match with the grammatical gender and this can be seen in the third example, die Postangestellten, the postal employees. This word is a gender fluid word. It can either have a masculine gender or a feminine gender, depending on the context. And it is a so-called substantivated participle 2 verb form, a neutral form that can be used for males, females, or non-binary people alike. But during the part of speech tagging, like you can see on the screen, it was assigned the masculine gender. So I had to move it manually to the neutral group. And there were a few more examples of that. And the goal of this part of speech tagging was to get a first overview of the distribution of the different naming forms in my data. So one of the advantages of this method is that it's a very inductive approach. So even terms one would not expect are also captured by the machine. Also, there is no loss due to spelling errors because the part of speech tagging takes the position of a word in the sentence into account. So the OCR mistakes did not matter that much. It was still recognized. On the other hand, there is no context given in the part of speech tagging. It was just a list of words that I received. So the generic masculine form could not be recognized. And due to problems with the layout analysis and the OCR HTR recognition, some nouns were recorded without an ending, so I had to remove them from the analysis. Secondly, I did a manual annotation of one protocol every 10 years. And then I again grouped the names into male, female, and neutral group names. This was in order to find out more about the use of the generic masculine form. And also I wanted to find out more about when these neutral group names were used in the protocols. So the main advantage of this is that the context now is part of the analysis. This means that the generic masculine form can be detected. And secondly, all forms that appear on paper are also detected. So it's once again a more inductive approach. And a limitation is that I only looked at one protocol every 10 years. So depending on the topic that was talked about in this protocol, certain linguistic patterns might not be detected, or some group names might not appear at all in these protocols and then would not be part of my result. And lastly, I did a search for different terms using regular expressions. So I looked at the feminine suffix innen, and I searched for pair forms, and also the neutral suffix kräfte, which translates to forces, and the male form of worker. This was to find out more about certain group names that caught my eye during the first two parts of the analysis, during the part of speech tagging and manual annotation. And I will go into that a bit later in my presentation again. So on one hand, the advantage of this method is that the context is again part of the analysis. And also I was able to look at the entire data set for one specific variant and did not just look at an individual protocol like before. A limitation, on the other hand, is that it is a very deductive analysis because you look directly for variants that you would expect to appear, but you don't go beyond that and you don't find things that you would not expect in the protocols. I now briefly want to speak about the results that I found using these three methods. So for the part of speech tagging and the manual annotation, I found that the generic masculine form appeared in all protocols, but it was never the dominant variant. Instead, when speaking of groups, the Federal Council used mostly neutral forms, especially collective names like the delegation decided, or substantivized adjectives like the sick. And I also noticed that female forms only made up about 2 to 3% of all group names in the corpus. Since I am a social linguist, I wanted to find out more about the social part that was behind these naming forms. And I then asked myself if there is a hierarchical social structure visible in these historical group naming practices of the federal government. And through the analysis of the regular expressions, I found out that yes, indeed, there are hierarchical structures visible, and I want to explain this a bit more using two types of neutral group names, the pair forms and also the suffix kräfte. So the pair forms reflect a hierarchy, since either the masculine or the feminine form must be in the first position. There's no way around it. And according to the literature, the element that is most important to the dominant societal group always takes up the first position in the pair form. Adults therefore appear before children, humans appear before animals, which then again appear before machines. And since white Swiss men are the dominant societal group, males appear before females. And this was also reflected in the pair forms that I looked at, since 84% begin with the masculine form. And there are a few exceptions to this rule, but these forms also reflect the worldview of the dominant group. So if Swiss women are mentioned with foreign men, the females appear first in the pair form. Therefore, the citizenship of a person trumps their gender. And so it's more important that a person is Swiss than that they are male. Secondly, the age difference also plays a role, and adults stand before adolescents. And also, if a woman occupies a higher job position, she was then mentioned first. Lastly, when the Federal Council writes about stereotypical female jobs in the protocols, like caretakers, nannies, or nurses, the woman also again appears first in the pair form. There are also some further examples of pair forms in which women are not directly mentioned. In the first example, the ranking goes from animate to inanimate in human, animal, and machine workforce. And then I also noticed that masculine group names usually come before neutral group names, which then could also imply that there is a hierarchy in place and that neutral forms might hierarchically not be on the same level as masculine forms, since the masculine form generally stands in the first position. This hierarchy then is also made visible when looking at the neutral suffix kräfte. This naming practice is almost exclusively used for minorities and not for people who belong to the dominant societal group. And when I analyzed the collocations and looked which words appeared together with the suffix kräfte, it became apparent that mainly foreign, low-paid, low-skilled, or female workers were referred to with the suffix. For example, as cheap workforce, female workforce, Italian workforce, youth workforce, or assisting workforce. This has also been widely discussed in the literature, where, for example, Susan Romain stated that when gender-neutral terms are introduced into a society still dominated by men, these words either lose their neutrality or they are de- or repoliticized by sexist language practices of the dominant group. This means that neutral forms are not really neutral, since they are only used for the minority group, and there is therefore still a social hierarchy in place. And these two types of group references, the masculine form on the one hand and the neutral form on the other hand, are not on the same level. The masculine form is hierarchically higher since it is used for the dominant group, while the neutral form is mainly used for minorities, and so it's lower. I now come to my conclusion. Through the complementary use of the three different methods, the part of speech tagging, regular expressions, and manual annotation, I was able to achieve a comprehensive analysis of the use of group names in the Federal Council protocols. And secondly, despite the use of gender-inclusive naming practices throughout the protocols, it still shows that these neutral forms are not always neutral, but instead they reflect the societal hierarchy of time. Thank you.